They asked her to sit below the family. The Duke moved his chair beside her. Her grandmother had said it first. The winter sable was 7 years old and standing barefoot in the snow because she had given her only pair of boots to a younger child in the village who had none. The table you are seated at does not determine the feast you carry inside you. Her grandmother had pressed those words into her palm like a coin. Sable had carried them the same way ever since. Not displayed, not spoken aloud very often, but held. Warm. Real. The way you carry something you are certain you will need. She was 23 now, and the night she would need it most had finally arrived. Chapter 1. The invitation that was not for her. The letter came addressed to her aunt. Sable Voss saw it arrive on a silver tray carried by a liveried messenger who smelled of pine resin and power, the particular scent of a pack that ran old forests, pack that had territory stretching from the Blackthorn Mountains to the sea. The Ravenscroft pack. Ruled by Duke Corvin Ravenscroft, the unmated Alpha King of the Northern Territories, whose very name made women press their hands to their hearts like they were keeping something from escaping. The letter was a dinner invitation. Autumn equinox, the great hall of Ravenscroft Keep, a gathering of the 7 noble families of the northern reaches. The Voss family was one of those 7, technically. Barely. They were the smallest, most diminished branch of a bloodline that had once been prosperous before 3 bad winters, and one catastrophic business decision had reduced them to a townhouse with drafty windows and a reputation that was more history than present. Sable was not the Voss heir. She was the ward, the niece taken in after her parents died when she was 12, raised not unkindly, but never warmly either. Always at the margin of every photograph, every feast, every occasion. She had no wolf. That was the thing that defined her absence in every room she occupied. The shift had never come for her. At 14, then 16, then 18, when other young wolves bloomed into their second nature, she had remained singular and still. Wolfless. Packless in the deepest sense, though she lived among wolves. Her aunt, Drusilla Voss, had 3 daughters, Tamsin, Brielle, and Lowen. All shifted, all beautiful in the particular way of women who had grown up certain they deserved to be seen. When the letter arrived, Drusilla read it twice and called for the seamstress. She did not call for Sable. Sable found out about the dinner the same way she found out about most things, by being in the room where it was being discussed and being so thoroughly overlooked that the discussers forgot to lower their voices. "Will Sable come?" That was Lowen, the youngest, who sometimes remembered to ask. "She'll need to be there in some capacity." Drusilla's voice had the quality of someone calculating aloud. "Someone to manage the girl's wraps. The carriage steps are narrow and she can handle—" Sable stopped listening. She went to her room, sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and held the old words from her grandmother in the architecture of her chest until they stopped hurting. She would go. Not as a servant. She was not a servant. She was family, however inconveniently. But she understood the role she was expected to occupy, and she understood she could not refuse to occupy it without a fight she did not currently have ammunition for. She pressed her hand to the small wooden button she kept on her bedside table. A button from her grandmother's coat, dark wood carved with a tiny running wolf, the only thing she had left of her, and she made herself breathe. The table you are seated at does not determine the feast you carry inside you. Fine, then. She would go. She would carry her feast quietly and keep her dignity. What she could not have predicted was that the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories would notice. Chapter 2. Arrival at Ravenscroft. Keep the keep materialized from autumn fog like something geology had decided rather than something built. Stone towers the color of charcoal, ivy burning red and copper across the face of the walls, torches in iron brackets throwing gold against the dark. The Ravenscroft sigil, a raven mid-flight, talons open, was worked into every gate, every lintel, every surface that could hold a carving. Inside, the great hall had been dressed for the equinox. Long tables draped in deep burgundy cloth, candelabras like small forests of flame, the smell of roasted game and wood smoke, and the faint mineral edge of magic that old packs carried in their very walls. Drusilla had arranged the seating in the carriage on the way over, her voice pleasant and final. The Ashbrook family will be placed centrally, as will the Fenwick contingent. We'll be at the third table from the head. A pause. Sable, you'll sit at the auxiliary table. The auxiliary table. There was one, pushed slightly apart from the main arrangement, meant for overflow guests, servants traveling with titled masters, pack members of lesser standing who had nonetheless needed to be included for logistical reasons. It was not at the other end of the room. It was simply adjacent. Beside the family, but not of it. Close enough to be summoned, far enough to signal status. Sable said nothing. She helped Lowen with her wrap on the carriage steps. She carried the small bag her aunt had handed her without ceremony, and she walked into Ravenscroft Keep wearing the one good dress she owned, deep green, several seasons out of fashion, but clean and well-fitting in hers. The hall was already half full. The other noble families arrived in waves, their packs moving with that particular coordinated ease of wolves who ran together. Sable felt it the way she always felt it, not painfully, not anymore, but as a kind of structural awareness. She was here, and they were here, and they occupied space differently than she did. She found the auxiliary table, sat down, set her small bag beneath her chair. Across the room, through the layered candlelight and the moving bodies of arriving guests, she was unaware of being observed. Chapter 3. The Duke who watched Corvin Ravenscroft stood at the edge of his own hall the way he always did for the first hour of any gathering, still positioned with his back partially to the room, appearing to examine one of the old portraits on the stone wall, actually watching everything. His beta, a sharp-featured man named Aldrich, stood beside him. Between them existed the particular shorthand of men who had been soldiers together before one of them became a duke. The Voss contingent has arrived. Aldrich's voice was barely breath. I see them. The 3 daughters are, I see them. What Corvin saw, specifically, was not the 3 daughters in their new gowns finding their places at the third table with the practiced confidence of women accustomed to being placed well. What he saw was the young woman in the green dress who had parted from the group without fanfare, without complaint, and taken herself to the auxiliary table at the room's margin as if she had been asked to do something perfectly reasonable. He watched her settle, watched her straighten the small bag beneath her chair with one careful foot, as if it mattered to her that it not be in anyone's way, watched her fold her hands on the tablecloth and look out at the hall with an expression that was not embarrassed, and not bitter, and not performing dignity. She simply had it. Still and genuine, like a lamp lit in an empty room. He had met thousands of wolves. He had sat through hundreds of these dinners. He was 31 years old, and he was tired of every person in every room performing something for him. This woman was not performing anything. Who is she? He asked it quietly. Aldrich took a moment. The ward, Sable Voss, niece of Drusilla. There's a note in the file, actually. No wolf, no shift. That wasn't what I asked. Aldrich turned to look at him, and Corvin felt the shift in his beta's attention. The careful recalibration of someone who recognized that his alpha had just moved from general observation to specific interest. I'll find out more, Aldrich said. Do that. Corvin set down the glass he'd been holding and straightened his coat. After you have the steward adjust the seating, Aldrich paused. The seating is already set. Then have it unset and reset. Chapter 4. The chair Sable had just decided that the bread, at least, was exceptional. Dense and dark and seated, the kind of bread you could build a meal around, when the steward appeared beside her. He was a tall man, correct in posture, with the quiet authority of someone who ran a great house and knew the weight of every decision made within it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Miss Voss. His voice was low and professional. His Grace requests that a place be set for you at the family table. Sable blinked. I'm sorry? At the main table. We'll have a setting arranged immediately. She looked across the hall. The main table, the first table, the one where the most prominent families were seated, the one closest to the great carved chair at the head, had 8 seats, all currently occupied by names that carried weight in the north. The Ashbrooks, the Fenwicks, the heads of the other named families, and her aunt's family, at the third table, who were at this moment staring at her with an expression she could feel across the distance, like a hand around her throat. I think there may be a mistake, she said carefully. There is no mistake, Miss Voss, if you'll follow me. She followed. She was aware of eyes. The hall was not silent. Conversation continued. Music played from the gallery above, but she felt a tension moving over her like water finding level. She kept her chin up and her footsteps even, and she thought of her grandmother's words and of the small wooden button in her pocket, which she had tucked there at the last moment before leaving, because tonight had felt like a night to carry it. The steward stopped at the main table, and then Corvin Ravenscroft, the Duke himself, tall and dark-haired, and built with the particular contained power of an alpha who didn't need to perform his authority either, stood up from the great carved chair at the head of the table, and moved it, not to make room for another chair to be inserted beside it. He physically lifted his own chair and repositioned it, setting it down beside the new setting being laid for her, so that when she sat, she would be at his right hand. Not simply at the main table, beside him. The hall did not go entirely silent, but it came close. He looked at her across the space that remained between them, perhaps 6 feet, perhaps less, and he was not smiling in the practiced way of powerful men who know they are being watched. He was simply direct. His eyes were dark gray, the color of the stone of his own walls, and they were focused on her with an attention that felt nothing like scrutiny and everything like recognition. Miss Voss, he gestured toward the seat. Please. Sable sat down. She was aware of her aunt's face at the third table. She was aware of every other face in the room. She was aware that her dress was several seasons old, and that her hands, as she spread the napkin across her lap, were not the hands of a woman who had lived softly. She was aware of all of it, and she put it all aside, because the Duke of Ravenscroft had just sat down beside her and was offering her the breadbasket with the particular casualness of someone who has decided that this is simply how the evening will go. The dark bread is particularly good tonight, he said. I noticed that earlier, she said, before she could calculate whether it was the right thing to say. Something in his face, not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one, shifted. You did. I was sitting somewhere I could think about it without interruption. And there, the smile came, small and real and nothing like his public face. Then I owe you an apology for the interruption, he said, and I'll try to be worth it. Chapter 5. The Feast. He was worth it. Not in the way she might have feared, not all performance and power on display, not a man using dinner conversation to audition her for something. He talked to her the way she realized slowly. Very few people had ever talked to her, as if her answers mattered, as if the next thing she would say was something he was genuinely curious about. He asked about the Voss library, because he'd heard the family had one of the oldest collections in the northern reaches. She told him it did, and that she'd read most of it, because it was hers to use, and she had availed herself of it completely. She told him about the herbology manuscripts from 3 centuries past that she'd cross-referenced with more recent natural philosophy texts, and found several significant discrepancies no one had apparently noticed. He was not merely polite about this. He leaned forward slightly. What kind of discrepancies? In the growth mapping of medicinal nightshade variants. The old texts locate certain strains specifically to the Blackthorn slopes, which is your territory, but the later authors claim the strains are regional. I think they're wrong. I think the old authors were right, and the later ones simply didn't have access to your mountains. He was quiet for a moment. There are strains on the northern Blackthorn slopes that our healers have been using for 2 centuries that don't appear in any natural philosophy catalog I've seen. She looked at him. I would very much like to see them. Then you should come and see them. The way he said it, not as social pleasantry, not as a performance of generosity, but as a simple fact he had just decided, landed somewhere in her chest, and stayed there. Around them, the dinner moved through its courses. Her aunt sent one of the daughters, Tamsin, past the main table on an invented errand, clearly designed to insert the family into the Duke's orbit. He greeted Tamsin briefly and returned his attention to Sable. Tamsin retreated. Across the table, one of the Ashbrook men tried several times to draw the Duke into political conversation, and was met with the minimum courtesy that still constituted courtesy before the Duke turned back to the woman at his right. Sable noticed all of this and tried not to read too much into it. But the thing she couldn't stop noticing was simpler. He never made her feel small. In a hall full of people who were watching to see whether she would know the correct fork, whether her dress was right, whether she would say something that revealed the particular quality of her marginal status in the Voss household, he simply wasn't interested in any of that architecture. He was interested in nightshade variants and old manuscripts, and, at one point, what she thought about the way the equinox feast had changed over the generations based on records she'd read. "You've read records of previous equinox feasts?" he asked. "Your family sends copies of certain ceremonial documents to each of the 7 families, archivally, for record-keeping." "I was not aware of that." "You have a lot of documents," he laughed. An actual laugh, not a polished one. It changed his face dramatically, made him younger, and made him look like someone who did not get to do that often enough. She felt the warmth of her grandmother's words somewhere deep and wordless, and thought, this is what it is to be a feast. Not the table. The feast. Chapter 6. The Garden After Dark. When the meal concluded and the hall shifted into the looser configuration of an autumn evening's socializing, the music louder, the candles lower, small groups forming and reforming, Sable excused herself quietly and found her way outside. The Ravenscroft garden in October was not the softened thing gardens usually were at the end of summer. It was skeletal and magnificent, the great old trees black against the deep blue dark, the last of the autumn roses gone to hip and thorn, the paving stones silver with the early frost that the equinox nights always brought. She stood near a stone bench and tipped her face up at the sky, and breathed the cold, clean air and let the evening reassemble itself inside her. Her hand found the wooden button in her pocket, without deciding to. She heard him before she saw him, not footsteps exactly, but the particular quality of the air changing when an alpha approached, a pressure, and a warmth that preceded the physical presence. "I guessed garden," Corvin said from just behind and to her left. "I had several other guesses, but garden seemed most likely." She turned. He had come out without his jacket, his formal coat left somewhere inside, and the cold air didn't seem to reach him the way it reached her. "Most likely based on what?" she asked. "Based on the fact that you spent an entire formal dinner being completely genuine, and genuine people generally need air afterward." He came to stand beside her, looking up at the same sky. "I also needed air." They stood without speaking for a moment that was not uncomfortable. The keep's towers rose behind them, torchlit and solid. Somewhere in the garden a last-season bird was making small sounds in the dark. "Why did you move your chair?" she asked. She had been carrying the question all evening, and the cold and the quiet made it easier to release. He was silent for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because where you had been placed was wrong. Not logistically wrong, categorically wrong. And I have spent too many years of my life sitting in the middle of things that are categorically wrong and saying nothing because the social architecture requires a certain silence." He paused. "I'm tired of that." "Your social architecture benefits you considerably," she said, not unkindly. "Yes, which is why my choosing to be tired of it is not particularly brave." He turned to look at her then. "What is your grandmother's saying? The one you've been thinking of all evening. I could see it in your face, at certain moments, like you were checking something." She stared at him. "How could you possibly know I have been watching you all evening, carefully. Not the way people watch someone they're sizing up. A beat. The way you watch someone you want to understand." The cold between them had a quality she did not have vocabulary for. She looked back at the sky. Then she told him. The words her grandmother had pressed into her palm like a coin. The winter, and the barefoot snow and the boots given away. The wooden button in her pocket. She showed him the button. She didn't know why. It seemed like the honest thing in a garden in October, with a man who had moved his chair. He held out his hand and she placed it in his palm, and he turned it in his fingers and looked at the tiny carved wolf on its face. She was a shifter, your grandmother? Yes, I come from shifters on every branch. It just didn't happen for me. He returned the button. His fingers brushed her palm as she took it back, and neither of them commented on this, though neither of them pretended it hadn't happened. And does it grieve you? She considered the honest answer. Some days, less than it used to. I've learned to know what I am without it. She closed her hand around the button. I am the books I've read, and the things I've noticed, and the things I've refused to pretend were acceptable. I am my grandmother's words. I don't need a wolf to be exactly what I am. Corvin Ravenscroft looked at her in the dark of his own garden, in the cold of the equinox night, for a long and deliberate moment. No, he said quietly, you don't. And then, not impulsively, not dramatically, but with the same deliberateness that seemed to characterize everything he did when he was being genuine, rather than ducal, he asked if she would walk the garden with him, and she said yes, and they walked until the torches inside had burned considerably lower. Chapter 7. Morning and what Drusilla. Said the morning after the equinox feast, Drusilla Voss was in a precise and controlled fury. Sable understood this before her aunt said a word. She understood it from the quality of the silence in the breakfast room, and from the way Tamsin and Brielle and Lowen were eating with excessive concentration, and from the set of her aunt's shoulders, which had the architecture of a woman who had prepared a speech. You made yourself conspicuous. Drusilla's voice was even, calm the way ice is calm. Whatever you said to him, whatever you positioned yourself to become in his eyes, I want to be clear that it is not appropriate. That table, that seat, the garden afterward. Yes, people saw you in the garden with him, Sable, and it reflects on this family in a way that I find deeply... He moved his chair, Sable said. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. I didn't ask him to. I sat where you put me, and he chose to change it. Men like that don't choose things without being maneuvered into them. This one does. She felt perfectly clear. I'm sorry if the evening was not what you hoped for, but I didn't do anything wrong. She stood up from the breakfast table, and I won't accept being told that I did. She left before Drusilla could reassemble herself into a second volley. In her room, she sat with the wooden button in her palm and breathed. She expected to feel shaky. She felt instead unusually solid, like something had been settled in her that had been unsettled for a long time. The letter arrived that afternoon, not for her aunt, not for the household generally, for Sable Voss specifically, in handwriting that was precise and characterful, and signed at the bottom with a single raven. It was an invitation to visit the Blackthorn slopes in the company of the Duke's head healer, to examine the nightshade variants in situ, and compare them against the manuscripts she had described. It was scholarly in tone and entirely proper in content. And at the very bottom, below the signature, in smaller and slightly less formal handwriting than the rest, I found myself looking up nightshade cataloging after you described the discrepancies. You're right. The later authors were wrong. CR. She read it 3 times. Then she sat down at her small writing desk and composed a reply that took her 4 drafts to get right. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she wanted to say it exactly. She said she would come. Chapter 8. What Grew in the Blackthorn Slopes. She went in November when the first real snow was on the mountains, but the slopes themselves were still accessible, and the nightshade grew in clusters along the south-facing rock ledges in a way that was nothing like any catalog description she had read. The head healer was a compact, energetic woman named Orveth, who had the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting years for a second opinion from someone qualified to give one. They spent the entire first morning examining root structures and cross-referencing against the pages of text Sable had brought, speaking the dense shorthand of two people who have immediately recognized each other as the same kind of thinker. Corvin joined them in the afternoon. He did not perform this. He arrived in working clothes, practical boots, a coat that had seen weather, and he crouched beside the rock ledge where Sable was sketching a root system and asked about what she was finding with the same quality of attention he had given her across the dinner table, which she now understood was simply what his attention was like, all of the time, when he considered something worth it. Over the following weeks she came 3 more times. Each time the scholarly reason was real and the scholarship was genuine, and something else was also real, and also genuine and growing with the same patient insistence as Nightshade on a south-facing slope. He told her about the weight of the duchy, the administrative reality of being the authority across a territory that size, the loneliness that the formal architecture of power builds around a person whether they want it or not. He did not tell her this with complaint. He told her with the factual tone of someone identifying a structural problem, and she recognized the tone because it was the same one she used when she described her own situation. She told him about growing up at the margin of the household, not the bitterness version. She had long since composted bitterness into something more useful. But the truth of it, the particular craft of learning to find worth in yourself when the people around you were consistently indicating that you had little. "You are the most precisely certain person I've ever met," he said once, when they were walking back from the slopes in the gray early dark of a November afternoon. "I don't mean certain of everything. I mean certain of yourself. It has a quality I haven't encountered before." "Necessity?" she said. "Yes. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to offer you something, and I'm aware the offer will have a specific weight given who I am, and I'm trying to account for that weight before I speak." She waited. "I want you to come here, not to examine plants, to have a role in this household that is built around what you actually are. A scholar, a person of genuine discernment, someone whose opinion I trust. And also because when you are not here, I notice it the way you notice when a fire goes out." He stopped walking. "I'm not asking you to be something for me. I'm telling you what I see when I look at you, and asking if you would consider staying." She looked at him for a long moment. The mountain dark was settling around them. She could see her breath in the cold air. "I would need it to be a genuine thing," she said, "not a kindness." "I am not a particularly kind man," he said. "I am an honest one." "Yes," she said. "I know." Then, "Yes." He exhaled, a long, quiet release, the breath of someone who had been bracing. And she saw in that exhale everything she needed to see about how seriously he had meant it. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They walked back to the keep in the last of the November light, and the raven above the gate held its carved wings spread like something about to become real. Epilogue. 1 year later. The autumn equinox dinner was held again. This year, Ravenscroft Keep had been dressed the same way. Burgundy cloth, candelabras like small forests of flame, the smell of roasted game and wood smoke, and the 7 families of the northern reaches arrived in the same waves of coordinated wolfies. There was no auxiliary table. Corvin had quietly had it removed from the room's configuration when he began planning this year's gathering. No explanation had been offered. The hall simply had one arrangement now: main tables, primary seating, every guest accommodated within the body of the feast, rather than at its edge. At the head table, in the chair to the Duke's right, a chair that was now permanently set there, that had its own place in the room's furniture plan, sat Sable. Not as a ward, not as a scholar in residence, which was the formal title she had accepted in January, and had spent the better part of a year making into something genuinely new, a role the duchy had needed, and not known it needed. Not as a guest. As the woman who was going to marry the Duke of Ravenscroft in the spring, a fact that had been announced 3 weeks ago and was still producing a particular quality of stunned silence in certain quarters of northern society, that Sable found she had very little difficulty bearing. Drusilla Voss was at the third table. She had not spoken to Sable in 6 months. Lowen, the youngest, had come separately and quietly, and said she was glad, and Sable had held her hand and meant it. The dinner moved through its courses. Beside her, Corvin was involved in a conversation with the Fenwick head about water rights in the Eastern Valley, the kind of administrative complexity that the duchy generated constantly, but his hand found hers under the table at one point, briefly, just a press of fingers, the particular shorthand of two people who have learned each other, and she squeezed back without looking up from her own conversation with Orveth the healer, who was very excited about what they had found in the spring cataloging and had opinions she needed to share immediately. When the meal concluded and the hall softened into evening, Sable excused herself and went to the garden. She had learned that this was a thing she did, that the garden was her place of equilibrium, the cold air her method of letting an evening settle, and she had stopped apologizing for it. Corvin always knew where she was. She stood near the stone bench. The October sky above the Blackthorn towers was deep and vast and starred. The frost was on the paving stones. The roses were gone to hip and thorn again. She took the wooden button from the pocket of her dress. She had sewn a pocket into every dress she owned, specifically for this, a practical decision that was also not only practical, and held it in her palm. The table you are seated at does not determine the feast you carry inside you. She had thought, when she was young, that the saying was about endurance, about surviving the insult of lesser treatment by believing privately in your own worth. She understood now that it was larger than that. The feast inside her, the scholarship and the stubbornness, and the specific quality of her attention, the love she was capable of, and the certainty she had built from the inside out, that feast had not been made richer by being moved to the head table. It had always been this rich. The head table had simply been rearranged to tell the truth. She heard the familiar shift in the air. His presence preceded him like warmth. "Garden," he said from behind her. "Always," she said. He came to stand beside her and she showed him the button, the way she sometimes did, in moments that felt like the kind that should be marked. The tiny carved wolf on its dark wood face. He took it briefly in his fingers, the same way he had the first time, and then returned it to her hand. "She would have liked you," Sable said. "Tell me why." "Because you don't perform," and she had no patience for performance. She closed the button in her fist. "She would have said you had a clear scent." "Meaning?" "Meaning you smell like what you are." She looked up at him. She was very particular about that. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with 2 fingers, unhurried, in the dark of the garden with no one watching, and no reason to be anything other than exactly what he was. "Keep the button," he said, though she had never once considered doing otherwise. "Put it in something when we build the house on the slopes. In the wall? Or the foundation? Something old to hold something new." She turned to look at him. The stars above the Blackthorn towers, the keep behind them, warm lit and permanent, the garden going silver with frost. "Yes," she said, simply. She put the button back in her pocket. His hand found hers. They stood in the cold and the quiet, carrying their feast between them, not performing anything for anyone, not enduring the margins of anything. Just 2 people who had looked at each other clearly, and decided that clarity was exactly enough. The raven above the gate held its carved wings open. Something had become real. End.